Psychoanalytic Theory of Adolescent Development. Introduction to Psychoanalytic Theory. Sigmund Freud developed a comprehensive theory of psychopathology, of personality, and of human development, and founded the psychoanalytic movement. His theory was revolutionary since it fundamentally changed the conceptual foundation of psychology and psychiatry of his time. It has remained influential to this day. Psychoanalysis was based on concepts and on insights into the workings of the human mind that had received little systematic attention in pre-Freudian psychology. The new ideas of physics and biology emphasized energy and dynamics and were prevalent toward the end of the 19th century. Darwin's notion of evolution influenced Freud's thinking and became part of his psychodynamic theory. He believed that all psychological events are tied to energy, drive, and instincts based on biological characteristics. Freud's theoretical assumption concerning the nature of man has dramatically changed man's conception of himself. Freud is often identified as one of the most important thinkers of the 20th century, comparable in influence to Copernicus and Darwin. Copernicus changed our geocentric view of the world. Darwin's theory removed the human race from its special position in relationship to God and placed it within the continuum of natural evolution as part of the animal world. Humans were seen as no more than just another animal with specific survival mechanisms. Freud, in turn, made explicit that humans were not the rational, logical, and intelligent beings they were believed to be, but instead were irrational and influenced by hidden unconscious motives of which they themselves were often not aware. Freud implied that the crucial psychological reality is desire rather than reason. The significance of Freud's work is not limited to psychology, psychiatry, and psychoanalysis proper. His ideas have also become influential in literature, art, advertisement, philosophy, sociology, medicine, and education. His contributions to our understanding of the mind have penetrated many areas of modern Western culture and thought to such an extent that his ideas have become part of people's implicit psychology to a much larger extent than is commonly acknowledged. Freud's contribution to our understanding of the nature of the mind contains several identifiable ideas. 1. All behavior is motivated, often by unconscious dynamics. 2. Freud's theory of dreams emphasized the meaningfulness of dreams as manifestations of the unconscious mind. 3. Similarly, Freud ascribes meaning to errors, forgettings, slips of the tongue, and other unintended behavior, believing that they are expressions of unconscious forces. 4. A major motivating force in human behavior is sexuality, including the idea of infantile sexuality. Freud emphasized the conflictual relationship between sexuality and civilization. 5. Early child-rearing experiences, especially in weaning, toilet training, and the role of the family in the handling of sexuality and aggression, are seen as significant factors in development. 6. Freud gave new hope to the treatment of psychopathology and changed social attitudes toward the neurotic and psychotic. After completion of his medical training, Freud began his medical career in Vienna as a research scientist in neurology, hoping to become a professor rather than a practicing physician. However, because he saw limited opportunities for advancement in a university setting, and since he needed to support his family, he was forced to practice medicine. As a medical specialist in neurology, he began to see patients with neuropsychological problems. The treatment of nervous disorders was a branch of medicine that was, at that time, primitive, and few treatment modalities existed that could successfully be used in dealing with patients with mental aberrations. Freud's scientific inclination led him to the discovery and development of new treatment methods. He systematically collected observational and case study data, supplementing them with his own famous self-analysis, to which he devoted the last half hour of each day from 1897 until his death in 1939. Freud's theory evolved only slowly and was a multifaceted theory of various models and explanatory systems of psychopathology, the nature of dreams, human motivation, and the inner workings of the mind. Like the theories of Copernicus, Darwin, and other revolutionary thinkers before him, Freud's formulations were met with bitter resistance and objections from other scientists. A rather careful review of the empirical research literature attempting to test Freud's theoretical assumptions concludes: large masses of experimental information are available for testing psychoanalytic propositions. We have been amused by the fact that while there is the stereotyped conviction widely current that Freud's thinking is not amenable to scientific appraisal, the quantity of research data pertinent to it that has accumulated in the literature grossly exceeds that available for most other personality or developmental theories. We have actually not been able to find a single systematic theory that has been as frequently evaluated scientifically as have Freud's concepts. Fisher and Greenberg, 1977. While not all of Freud's concepts receive unequivocal empirical support, many do, and many others receive at least partial support. Apparently, Freud's concepts of the oral and the anal personality, several aspects of the Oedipus complex theory, and his theory of the origin of paranoid delusions seem to find substantial support from empirical investigations. Other aspects of Freud's theory, such as the nature of dreaming, the effectiveness of psychoanalytic therapy, the psychology of women, and sex differences, are not borne out by empirical studies. In general, there is much more support for Freud's overall theoretical propositions concerning human nature and personality development than for his practical suggestions about conducting psychotherapy. Space does not allow discussion of the entire system of psychoanalytic theory. Therefore, in the context of theories of development, and especially theories of adolescence, only those models especially relevant to an understanding of personality development will be discussed. 1. The topographical model of the mind consists of three layers: the conscious, the preconscious, and the unconscious. This conceptualization of the tripartite organization of the mind grew out of Freud's book, The Interpretation of Dreams. 2. Another tripartite model of the mind, which Freud later developed in The Ego and the Id, was based on the structural hypothesis. It comprises the id, the ego, and the superego. These two systems are not only compatible, but have been integrated into a more dynamic view of the inner workings of the mind, and thus contribute to an understanding of personality development as well as to the dynamics of psychopathology. 3. The psychosexual stages of human development are the oral, anal, phallic, latency, and genital stages. These are of particular significance for our concern with theories of adolescence, since they constitute the cornerstone of Freud's developmental theory. 4. The mechanisms of defense: repression, displacement, identification, rationalization, reaction formation, introjection, projection, undoing, and denial. These are mechanisms by which the ego defends against the unacceptable and painful or anxiety-arousing wishes of the id. Anna Freud considered asceticism and intellectualization especially characteristic of pubescence. O. Rank also viewed asceticism as typical for adolescence, but contrasts it with its opposite, promiscuity. Freud's theory of psychosexual development has stimulated considerable research interest and further theoretical development in personality development in general and adolescent development in particular. Research was carried out by such psychoanalysts as Hartman, Horney, Sullivan, Winnicott, Fromm, Reich, Rank, Anna Freud, Erikson, and Bloss. Freud himself, partly because of this preoccupation with the role of infantile sexuality in normal and abnormal development, and partly because of his emphasis on the importance of the first 5 years of life in human development, climaxing in the Oedipus complex, placed relatively little emphasis on pubescence and adolescence. Many neo-Freudians seem to agree with this neglect of the period of adolescence in Freud's original theory. Among the neo-Freudians, E. Erikson and P. Bloss in particular have rectified this theoretical neglect by placing particular emphasis on the period of adolescence. Conscious, preconscious, unconscious. The first tripartite model of the mind emerged from Freud's efforts to explain the psychology of the dream processes. The mind, according to Freud, consisted of three layers: the conscious, the preconscious, and the unconscious. This early comprehensive theory of personality and development is referred to as the topographical model. The conscious is that layer of the mental apparatus of which the individual is aware. It provides contact with both the external world through perceptions, motor activity, and feelings, and with the internal personal world of dreams, images, and thoughts. Consciousness itself contains only a very small and limited part of the mental life. The metaphor often used is the iceberg, of which only a very small part floats over the surface while most of it is underwater. Freud emphasized that only a very limited part of our mental activity takes place in the conscious at any one time. However, the conscious also has the function of censorship, admitting or excluding thoughts and ideas from awareness. The much greater part of our mental activity remains more or less inaccessible in the lower regions of the mental structures. One of the major tasks of psychoanalytic treatment is, according to Freud, the uncovering of this hidden material to make unconscious content, motives, and dynamics conscious. It is assumed that only the patient's conscious understanding of these hidden dynamics makes a realistic and thoughtful adjustment possible, and this is the task of psychoanalytic therapy. The preconscious, in a certain sense, is part of the unconscious, since the individual is not aware of its content. Yet much of it, particularly in the upper regions of the preconscious, is easily accessible to the conscious, since the content can voluntarily be retrieved by directing one's attention to it. This can be achieved by asking relevant questions or by providing appropriate stimuli. The preconscious constitutes much of the mental warehouse of information and experiences, accessible through memory and therefore basically accessible to the conscious on request. Most of the ideas that are not at present in our awareness, but that can, through the process of memory, retrieval, and thinking, be brought back into our conscious mind, are in our preconscious. The preconscious, however, is not a passive storehouse of information, but is actively involved in many mental activities. According to Kubi, sudden insights into complex problems or creative thoughts and discoveries do emerge from preconscious processes. Often, the solution to a problem does not emerge while one is deliberately working on it, but seems to pop into one's mind from the preconscious without any conscious effort when one is relaxed or about to go to sleep. And sometimes, solutions emerge even when one is not consciously aware of the problem. The unconscious contains experiences and information that cannot readily be brought into awareness by volition, but requires special efforts, treatment, hypnosis, or interpretation to be brought back into the conscious. However, for Freud, the unconscious was the dominant force in the mental apparatus, especially in psychopathology. The pathway between the unconscious and the conscious is normally blocked, but the pathway between the preconscious and the conscious is at least partially open. The content of the unconscious, traumatic experiences, unacceptable impulses, and such, are kept in the unconscious by repression. However, they are not dormant, but remain dynamic and active. Although the constant process of repression itself is not conscious, it consumes psychological energy. However, repression is unable to restrain the unconscious impulses permanently. Hence, these impulses and experiences manifest themselves in distorted, non recognizable form in dream content, errors, accidents, and neurotic symptoms. Thus, an accident may be understood as an unconscious desire to punish oneself for forbidden thoughts or deeds. The craving for sweets is viewed as an unconscious symbolic repressed desire for human love. Dreaming is a process by which the repressed unconscious wish, the latent dream content, finds a distorted conscious manifestation in the dream experiences, the manifest dream content. Scientific evidence supports Freud's basic assumption that motives, wishes, feelings, and fantasies exist in an individual without conscious awareness of these hidden dynamic forces. Furthermore, these hidden forces are known to influence behavior. Id, ego, superego. Later, Freud developed in The Ego and the Id another tripartite model of the mind that is closely related to the topographical model of conscious, preconscious, and unconscious. Each component of this id, ego, superego model emerges during different stages of psychosexual development. The developmental model will be discussed later. In the structural model, Freud conceptualizes the structure of the mind as consisting of three major systems: the id, biological, the ego, psychological, and the superego, social. In the healthy adult person, these three systems, id, ego, and superego, form an integrated personality pattern which aids the individual in conducting daily interactions with the environment and allows satisfaction of basic needs and desires within socially prescribed limits. In the neurotic person, these systems are in conflict, necessitating the use of defense mechanisms or maladaptive manifestations, and thus reducing the efficiency of that person's everyday functioning. A number of psychoanalysts assert that some of the reemergence of infantile or childish behaviors that may occur in early adolescence is due to regression. Faced on the one hand by the problem of coping with a sudden upsurge in sexual and aggressive drives and anxiety that they create, and on the other hand by greatly increased social demands, the adolescent may temporarily abandon anxiety producing and not always successful efforts at more mature responding and retreat to more primitive responses that were successful and rewarding in an earlier, simpler period. Conger, 1977. The id is present at birth and governed by the pleasure principle. The id provides the mind with its psychological energy, impulses, and motivation to act. It represents the biological component of the mental apparatus, including untamed passion. It contains irrational instinctual appetites and impulses, and its purpose is to gratify basic instinctual and bodily needs and reduce the tensions produced by these biological needs. The contents and the processes of the id are primarily, but not exclusively, unconscious. Tension reduction, which comes about when basic biological needs are gratified, is pleasurable. Hence, the object that reduces bodily tensions becomes attached or cathected to the id. Freudians speak extensively of libidinal object finding, and the object can be a thing, the self, or part of the self, or another person, oral object choice, anal object choice, parent object choice, Oedipal object choice, same sex and opposite sex object choice. In the young infant, the drive of the id is not yet restrained by moral or practical considerations, but is directly oriented toward drive gratification. The operations of the id are therefore referred to as primary processes. Even later in life, an id dominated personality asserts little or no control over instinctual wishes and sexual desires. Such a person's behavior is mainly influenced by the immediate gratification of the pleasure seeking motive and would show little concern either for the demands of reality or for social or ethical values. The acting out juvenile delinquent, as well as the promiscuous sexual behavior of the adolescent, seem to be illustrations of id dominated behavior. Development of the ego. The ego develops in part out of the id during the end of the first through the second year of life and is defined by its reality testing functions. The most important function of the ego is the adaptation of the individual to reality. Toilet training advances ego development since it contributes to the delineation of body boundaries, or, in a more general sense, to a distinction between the self and the outside world. The ego represents the psychological component of the personality, but the id still remains the dominant element in the partnership between the id, ego, and superego. This emergence of the ego out of the id takes place when the demands of the id are not met and transactions between the organism and the outside world become necessary to discharge tensions. When needs are not satisfied, two consequences can occur. 1. The infant remains in a state of tension. 2. The id, having to cope with unresolved tension, is transformed into a new structure, the I or the ego, which takes into account the external reality that does not allow the uninhibited gratification of impulses. And in the process, the maturing child learns to cope with the tensions stemming from the needs of the id that are in conflict with the demands of reality. The ego serves several functions in the mental apparatus. First and foremost, the function of the ego is to compromise between the inner world of subjective experiences, the id, and the demands of the external objective world. It obeys the reality principle. The ego has a reality testing function. That is, it delays, inhibits, restrains, and controls the demands of the id. Not permanently, however, but only in order to maximize its gratification at the appropriate time and place, when short range as well as long range consequences are being considered, and when the gratification of a desire is actually in the individual's best interest. The ego also considers whether the object is appropriate for the gratification of the needs of the id. The ego takes on several other functions. It prevents a drive discharge when such behavior would not be in the individual's best interest. That is, it helps the individual develop impulse control and frustration tolerance. It also controls the ideas that enter consciousness. Furthermore, through various defense mechanisms at the disposal of the ego, ideas that are dangerous or arouse anxiety may be prevented from entering the conscious or may be distorted. The ego thus guides the behavior of an individual toward goals that are realistic and are assumed to have no negative consequences. In that sense, all cognition is a function of the ego. Finally, the ego encompasses logical thinking. The ego represents the external world to the id. It consists of reason, common sense, and reality testing functions, but serves the purpose of the id from which it borrows its energies. The metaphor used by Freud was that of the horse, id, constituting instinctual drive and energy, and the rider, ego, who controls where and how fast the horse can go. The ego's relation to the id might be compared with that of a rider to his horse. The horse supplies the locomotive energy, while the rider has the privilege of deciding on the goal and of guiding the powerful animal's movement. But only too often there arises between the ego and the id the not precisely ideal situation of the rider being obliged to guide the horse along the path by which it itself wants to go. Sigmund Freud, 1933-1964. On the other hand, there often are no real differences between the goals of the id and the ego, only differences in the way these goals can be attained. The ego tries to avoid the negative consequences that could result from an uninhibited gratification of the id impulses. Development of the superego. Later in human development, during the latency period, the superego develops, primarily as a function of the resolution of the Oedipus complex. Freud views the superego as the heir of the Oedipus complex. Research findings suggest that the development of the superego is less a direct outgrowth of Oedipal tensions and conflicts with the father than Freud suggested. Instead, the mother's and other people's standards play a larger role and are more positively assimilated and gradually integrated in the self structures that Freud had theorized. The Oedipal struggle itself is resolved most effectively, not out of fear of the father, which is castration anxiety, but out of the nurturant, friendly attitude on the father's part. The superego represents the social moral component in the personality. It represents the ideal rather than the real and strives for perfection. The individual's internalized moral code develops out of a process of identification with one's parents and their standards as to what is good or bad, virtuous or wicked. Later, the superego becomes the internal representation not only of parental mores, but, in a more generalized sense, of societal rules and cultural restrictions on the expression of instinctual drives. The development of the superego approaches its completion at the beginning of puberty, which means that self control begins to replace the control through reward and punishment by parents, and anxiety and guilt become the self administered punishment of the superego. The superego has two components: the conscience, which reacts to moral transgressions by producing guilt feelings when internalized moral values are violated, and the ego ideal, which produces pride and satisfaction when behavior corresponds to internalized standards. At this point of development, when the tentative balance between id, ego, and superego is just beginning to emerge, the awakening sexual tensions of puberty demand id gratifications and thus produce serious conflicts in the personality structure. The superego serves three functions. 1. To inhibit, especially the aggressive and sexual impulses of the id that are not approved by society. 2. To persuade the ego to substitute moralistic goals for realistic goals. 3. To strive for perfection. Considering the relationship between the topographical model of the conscious, preconscious, and unconscious to the structural model of the id, ego, and superego provides a more dynamic understanding of the mental apparatus. The id corresponds most closely to the unconscious in the topographical model. The ego is not sharply distinguished from the id, but its lower portions flow into the id and the unconscious. Repressed ideas merge into the id but are sharply segregated from the ego by the resistance of repression. The ego cuts across all three layers of the topographical model. It is obviously present in the perceptual system of conscious. It may be that much of the ego is itself unconscious. Only part of it, probably, is covered by the term preconscious. The superego is also located in all three layers of the topographical model, and while it interacts with the ego, it also decides what part of the id may be allowed into the region of the ego. It must be emphasized that the model in Figure 2.1 is obviously only a human construct developed to explain the inner workings of the mind. It is not material or physiological, and the dividing lines are not as neat and clear cut as the illustration suggests. What are depicted are functions of awareness, not locations in the brain. Sigmund Freud's stages of psychosexual development. Psychosexual development, according to Freud, begins in early infancy and passes through a series of predetermined, highly differentiated stages, named according to the body zones or erogenous zones that provide libido satisfaction during a particular developmental period. Freud assumed that these stages are universal in that each individual, regardless of society and culture, must move through this invariable sequence of psychosexual experiences to reach maturity, almost as if it was part of human nature. Development progresses because the child derives pleasure from different parts of the body at different times, and therefore, each developmental stage is identified by the psychosexual mode of the body area that dominates in its urge toward pleasure and satisfaction: oral, anal, phallic, and genital. During the latency period, the libidinal drive is repressed. Even the personality structure of some adults can be classified by their preferred mode of libido gratification: the oral, eating, smoking, talking; the anal, saving, hoarding, or giving away; the phallic, aggressive, intrusive; and the genital types. This sequential order of normal development can be disrupted by fixation or regression. Fixation can occur at any point in development, with the individual remaining at least partially at an immature level of libido gratification and not moving on to more mature levels. Illustrations of oral fixation are alcoholism, excessive smoking, or compulsive eating. Regression takes place when the individual encounters serious frustration in psychosexual development and therefore returns to less mature and safer stages in order to attain libido satisfaction. The typical example is the child's return to thumb sucking when a younger sibling is born. The adolescent unsuccessful in dating or sexually rejected may regress to less mature behaviors, play with younger children, or age inappropriate toys. Fixation and regression occur when progress toward more mature levels of sexual development encounters serious frustration from the environment. Fixation can also result from overgratification at a particular stage. Thus, spoiling the child may impede progress toward heterosexual maturity. The oral stage. During the first year of life, the oral region is the primary source of pleasure. The child gets pleasurable autoerotic stimulation not only from sucking, drinking, and eating, but also through oral activity not motivated by hunger, such as thumb sucking and sucking a pacifier or various other objects placed in the mouth. At this age, the mouth is a dominant erogenous zone. This pleasure is expressed by spitting out. Libidinal energies are directed toward an oral object choice. The love object at this early stage of development is the self. Self love often precedes object love, since the young infant has no perception of objects in the outside world as separate from the self. Self love is narcissistic, a concept Freud adopted from Greek mythology. During this stage, the ego remains undeveloped, and the energies of the id seek satisfaction with little concern for reality or even awareness of possible dangers. Oral characteristics manifest themselves later in life through overeating or by finding primary satisfaction through drinking, smoking, kissing, or talking. Even the aggressive component of the stage can express itself in making biting remarks or in oral sarcasm. The anal stage. During the second year of life, partly as a result of the social demand for toilet training, the primary erogenous zone shifts from the oral to the anal region. Libido is now invested in an anal object choice. During this stage, the infant must learn to regulate bodily impulses and to postpone immediate gratification in order to meet the demands of the external reality. Hence, the ego develops. From anal activity, the infant may derive not only pleasure, but also a feeling of power over the mother from both holding back, prolonging evacuation in order to obtain stronger sensations, and letting go, experiencing relief and pleasure from evacuation. The oral and the anal stages are basically autoerotic phases. Depending on the severity and the method of toilet training, anal attributes may emerge as personality characteristics. Fixation at the anal stage or repression to the stage may produce anal erotic conflicts, which manifest themselves in one of the two modalities of the anal stage: retention or expulsion. The retentive component is most obvious in the stingy person who holds on to all kinds of objects, especially money. This person is most likely stubborn, over-controlled, fussy, and excessively concerned with neatness, cleanliness, and orderliness. The expulsive type, in contrast, lets go, both emotionally and physically. Emotional outbursts, temper tantrums, and rage. This person is a spendthrift and is rebellious, unclean, messy, and disorderly. Factor analytic studies have demonstrated that clusters of traits corresponding to the basic qualities of the oral or anal personality, such as parsimony, neatness, and obstinacy, do occur together in children and adults, as would be predicted on the basis of Freud's theory. There is a paucity of data, rather than negative evidence, to clearly show that oral and anal personality traits originate in these crucial early developmental stages. Scattered bits of evidence, including anthropological data, suggest that such a relationship between early childhood experiences and adult personality patterns thus indeed exists. The phallic or infantile genital stage. Although the oral and the anal stages are basically pregenital stages, children in the phallic stage, from about 3 to 6, become interested in their own sex organs and feelings. Fantasies and preoccupations with sexuality begin to predominate. Touching and manipulating one's sex organs is experienced as pleasurable, and playful masturbation can be expected at this stage, even though it does not necessarily lead to orgasm. The oral, anal, and phallic stages are narcissistic stages, since all libido satisfaction is derived from stimulation of one's own erogenous zones. However, during the phallic stage, the object of the libido begins to change. The self as the love object is replaced by a parent object choice, and the parent object is the opposite sex parent, leading to the Oedipal situation. In Greek mythology, Oedipus kills his father and marries his mother. Since the reproductive organs of the sexes are different, and since the roles each parent plays in the life of the child are different, the events that occur during the phallic or infantile genital stage are also different for the two sexes. However, Freud is much more explicit in explaining the events in the boy, and his account of the male's Oedipal situation is generally better known and receives stronger empirical support than the electrocomplex, which represents the girl's experience. During the phallic stage, the male child begins to take pride in his penis. He values and idealizes it. With increased sexual desire, his love for his mother becomes erotic, and he begins to view his father as a rival. Wanting exclusive possession of his mother leads to the Oedipal conflict. His feelings toward his father are ambivalent. On the one hand, he identifies with his father and loves him. On the other hand, he sees his father as an obstacle to his incestuous wishes and has aggressive feelings toward him. Since he knows his father is more powerful than he is, he fears that the father may cut off the offending sex organ, something that apparently must have happened to girls who lacked a protruding penis. This insight leads to a fear that Freud identified as castration anxiety. As an outgrowth of castration anxiety, the incestuous wishes for the mother are repressed. Three additional factors contribute to the resolution of the Oedipus complex. 1. The realization that social taboos forbid him to possess the mother sexually. 2. Disappointment from the mother. And 3. Maturation. Eventually, the child resolves the conflict by identifying with his father, hoping to become like his father so that he too can eventually possess a wife. Through the resolution of the Oedipus complex, the child begins to incorporate parental and later social moral values to his personality structure, thus contributing to the development of the superego during the latency period which follows. Fisher and Greenberg, 1977, report, based on their extensive review of the research literature concerned with the Oedipal concept, that there exists fairly convincing evidence that men do have differentiated attitudes about their parents that mirror a history of sexually tinged rivalry with father for mother as a love object. The male does, as Freud proposed, experience castration anxiety, and this anxiety is intensified by exposure to erotic stimuli. The processes in the female, referred to as the Electra complex, are reverse, less complicated, less dramatic, begin later, and last longer than in the boy. And Freud is less specific in identifying the underlying dynamics. He has also received less empirical support for these conceptualizations. The girl, like the pre Oedipal boy, loves her mother. With the increasing awareness of her sex organs, she discovers that she lacks something the boy has, feels castrated, and blames her mother for her missing organ. As her relationship with her mother weakens, she turns her love to her father and develops an attitude of both jealousy and sexual attraction, referring to as penis envy. Again, confrontation with the impossibility of attaining the desired penis and aided by maturational processes helps the girl, under normal circumstances, resolve the electrocomplex. However, the resolution of the electrocomplex proceeds more slowly and continues throughout the latency period into adolescence. Empirical evidence suggests that the female is more likely to resolve her Oedipal conflict out of fear of loss of love than the male, and is less motivated by castration anxiety. In general, fewer empirical investigations have tested the Oedipal theory as it applies to females. Some of Freud's assumptions about sexual development have been criticized and challenged, especially as they apply to female sexual development. The phallic stage is sometimes referred to as little puberty. Apparently, Freud felt that in terms of evolutionary theory, The human race had evolved from a species that reached its reproductive maturity at the human age equivalent of about 5 or 6. Thus, the little puberty is a hypothesized remnant of sexual development in evolutionary terms. Even the body zone identified by the names given to these two stages, phallic for little puberty and genital for actual puberty, refer basically to the same body zone. The masculine term phallic in the early stage reflects the strong male orientation of much of Freud's theory. However, the implications of this evolutionary aspect of Freud's theory allow for interesting comparison. The phallic stage is then the vestige of that pre-human adolescence. The period between these two adolescences has some stability, while the periods before and after latency are full of rapid change, conflict, and psychological problems stemming from urgent libidinal demands. Sexual latency. With the successful resolution of the Oedipus complex, the child enters the relatively calm period of latency. The libido drive is less urgent, and more importantly, no new object choice emerges. It is during latency, as a byproduct of the resolution of the Oedipus complex, that the identification with the parents becomes strong, and hence the superego develops. The period itself covers the elementary school years, although there are individual age variations. During this period, the aggressive impulses, the sexual instincts, and the libidinal forces go undercover. The traumatic experience of having been deprived of fulfilling the sexual desires during the Oedipal situation restrains the child for several years from seeking an overt affectionate relationship. Several writers disagree with Freud's assumption of a period of sexual inactivity and sexual latency during this stage. White states, his assumption about the quiescence of sexual energies seems to be simply wrong. Anthropological evidence and better observation in our society have combined to cast grave doubt on the hypothesis of a biologically determined sexual latency. For once, we can almost say that Freud underestimated the importance of sex. The latency period, during which the child identifies with parents, is viewed by psychoanalysts as a period when important social and moral values are acquired. Schooling greatly facilitates learning general cultural values and acquiring fundamental social skills. New roles are tried in games and in play, and the development of motor ability is encouraged. Psychoanalysts are quick to point out that this is a period in the human life cycle when all known societies provide some formal training in essential skills, even though not necessarily the academic schooling of most Western societies. Toward the end of the latency period, orientation of interests, games, and play activities enter a homosexual phase in which friendship ties to one's own sex grow strong and often involve an exclusion of the opposite sex. During the transition from latency to puberty, and with the increase in sexual tension, sexual awareness, and sexual interests, even these same sex friendship patterns may become erotic in nature. Hence, homosexual activity in the form of genital exhibitionism, genital exploration, and masturbation are not uncommon during this prepubertal or early pubertal phase. Puberty, or the genital stage. Adolescence proper, brought about by the biological maturation of the reproductive system, is characterized by a rapid increase in sexual tensions demanding gratification. The sexual needs and fantasies become more explicitly concerned with tension release, and later with the sexual union of male and female. However, these inclinations are restrained by the social demands for adaptation to the moral values of society and the norms of the community. The magnitude of this situation becomes obvious if one considers that pubescence requires, for the first time since birth, that a basic biological drive, which acquires full strength only as a result of the pubescent growth changes, must be integrated into the personality structure of the young, still developing adolescent. This fact is complicated further by the traditional social, moral, religious standards, which demand that the heterosexual gratification of this drive be postponed until marriage, often as long as 10 to 15 years after the drive acquires its full biological strength. In terms of psychoanalytic conceptualizations, this means that the id impulses seeking gratification with new urgency clash with the recently developed and still formative superego, producing guilt feelings because the superego finds the demands of the id unacceptable. The ego, unable to satisfy both, feels crushed between the two powerful contenders. Thus, the new balance between id, ego, and superego, recently established during the latency period, is suddenly thrown out of balance, producing conflict, turmoil, and a psychological disequilibrium. These conflicts can be internal, a struggle between temptation and conscious, or they can be external, between parents and self. The ego attempts to cope with these conflicts, on the one hand, by denying the demands of the id through such mechanisms as repression or denial, or on the other hand, by quieting the superego through intellectualization, rationalization, asceticism, and regression. Sexual attraction, once more as in the phallic stage, turns to the opposite sex parent, and Freud does speak of a revival of the Oedipal situation during puberty, accompanied by the reawakening of castration anxiety. However, during latency, the development of the superego has proceeded to the point at which an internalized incest barrier will no longer allow these taboo feelings into full consciousness, and hence the ego uses defense mechanisms, especially displacement, to divert the incestuous demands of the libido towards somewhat more acceptable love objects. Freud commented that during early adolescence, a boy's first serious love object is most likely a mature woman, not unlike his mother, a common theme in French literature and movies. In much the same way, the pubescent girl often falls in love with older men, as seen in her crushes on and infatuations for teachers, movie stars, and entertainment heroes before she shows much interest in boys of her own age group. Thus, the first opposite sex love object of the adolescent is often, symbolically speaking, a mother or father figure, allowing the Oedipal wish an acceptable non incestuous substitute. And even later in adolescence, when the sexual object choice begins to turn to an opposite sex partner of the same age, the choice is often unconsciously motivated by patterns and traits prevalent in one's own parents. This idea is expressed well in the song, I Want a Girl Just Like the Girl That Married Dear Old Dad. Thus, unconscious motives determine the adolescent's attraction to a particular individual when falling in love, allowing the fulfillment of the Oedipal wish. Related to this second Oedipal situation is the adolescent task of freeing the self from emotional dependency on one's parents. The boy's libidinal attachment to his mother must be released, and he must also free himself from the dominance of his father. This process of detachment from the incestuous love object brings the problem of the generation into the foreground and gives it its psychoanalytic explanation. This process of emotional detachment results, at least for a time, in rejection, resentment, and hostility towards parents and other authority figures. The conflict between the generations has been a frequent theme in the literature on adolescence and is a fairly common everyday experience in many families. A fundamental task of the adolescent, as seen by psychoanalytic theory, is the attainment of genital primacy and the definitive completion of the process of non incestuous object finding. In other words, only through the emotional detachment from parents does the more permanent libidinal attachment to an opposite sex partner become possible. Mechanisms of defense. One of Freud's major contributions to an understanding of the dynamics of the mind, widely recognized even by professionals who tend to disagree with other assumptions of psychoanalysis, is the identification of defense mechanisms. They help the ego cope with anxiety, frustration, and unacceptable impulses and help relieve tension and inner conflicts. Since anxiety is likely to increase during periods of rapid developmental changes, and since adolescence is such a period, Old ways of responding no longer seem to work, and new patterns of adjusting have not yet been tried. The need for defense mechanisms is heightened during adolescence. Individuals develop such mechanisms, especially if they cannot deal with anxiety in a rational fashion, to defend themselves against the demands of the id or against conflicts with society. Some mechanisms of defense, such as denial, reaction formation, and projection, are considered more primitive, since their use suggests being out of touch with reality. Others, such as sublimation, undoing, rationalization, displacement, identification, and intellectualization, represent higher, or closer to normal, levels of functioning. Everybody seems to utilize some defense mechanisms at one time or another to cope with conflictual situations and to protect the personality from the stresses, anxieties, and frustrations of everyday living. It is only when a particular defense is used exclusively to deal with the tension between inner psychological reality and the demands of the external world that use of defense mechanisms becomes symptomatic of adjustment problems, neurotic tendencies, and even psychopathology. Of course, no individual makes use of all the possible mechanisms of defense. Each person merely selects certain of them, but these become fixated in his ego, establishing themselves as regular modes of reaction of that particular character, which are repeated throughout life whenever a situation occurs similar to that which originally evoked them. The most common defense mechanism, widely used even by normal people, is rationalization, a process in which one advances more or less plausible reasons to justify an act or an opinion, concealing to others and even to oneself the true reason or motive. Sometimes this mechanism is referred to as the sour grapes reaction, based on the famous fable in which the fox who cannot reach the luscious grapes claims that he doesn't want them after all because they are sour. The adolescent unable to attain a date with a highly desirable girl will tend to rationalize that he is better off without her because she talks too much, or is too spoiled, or is too popular, or is likely to lose her pretty figure at an early age. The high school girl ignored by the student council president may rationalize that the latter does not recognize her because he wears glasses and is probably nearsighted, when in fact, the school leader does not even know she exists. Rationalization can help us to cope with disappointment in two ways. One, it provides an acceptable justification for what we did or what we believe, or what we really wanted but could not attain. And two, it helps soften the anxiety and the disappointment connected with unattainable goals. We often rationalize failure by blaming circumstances rather than ourselves. We thus avoid the feeling of anxiety and guilt that would result if we acknowledge our own failures and inadequacies. Rationalization aids the ego by providing an excuse for something unattainable, unpleasant, or unacceptable. Methods of rationalization are used, especially if we are criticized or called upon to explain unacceptable or undesirable behavior. Adolescents use it vis a vis parents, and students vis a vis their teachers. However, frequent use of rationalization makes it impossible to learn from error and avoid mistakes, since such an approach impairs our coming to full awareness of our errors, mistakes, or other shortcomings. One avoids ownership of deficiencies. By rationalizing, one is denying a personal responsibility for one's shortcomings. Students who fail the exam but blame the test or the teacher rather than themselves free themselves from anxiety, but also absolve themselves from studying harder next time, having convinced themselves that it was not their fault. Repression, to some extent, is the purpose of all mechanisms of defense, and repressive components do accompany most of them. Repression deals with impulses from within, while denial relates to events that happen in the outside world. Repression should also be distinguished from suppression. Suppression is a conscious effort not to let ideas or impulses surface to awareness. Repression, in contrast, is an unconscious process of refusing to let into awareness the dramatic event, the stressful incident, or the unacceptable impulse. It was one of Freud's earliest constructs. Repression is less reality oriented than rationalization since the impulse is cut off from awareness but remains dynamically operative in the unconscious. Most people are unaware of their earlier sexual feelings towards the opposite sex parent. Socially taboo and highly traumatic early sexual experiences, such as incest or rape, may be expressed but dynamically operative in the adolescent's attitude towards sexuality. Thus, for example, a girl who is sexually attracted to her father will simply remove this intolerable incestuous thought from her consciousness. It may come up again in her dreams, but upon awakening, these two will be repressed. Repression is the metaphorical rug under which we sweep the garbage of our life to hide it, and although the garbage is no longer visible, it is still there. Displacement is a very important psychoanalytic defense mechanism used to explain how the affect or libidinal energy toward one object is transferred to a substitute object, which, while logically inappropriate, is quite appropriate for unconscious thinking. The original emotions remain the same, but the object to which the emotions are directed changes. An adolescent girl who experiences an intense fear of snakes may be displacing her underlying fear of a male's sexual organ. Displacement seems to be common when the original impulse or object is accompanied by a high degree of guilt or anxiety, or when libidinal energy is blocked. For example, the libidial drive toward masturbation during adolescence may be transferred to a compulsive need to wash one's hands. The connection between the two behaviors appears inappropriate. However, the hand is the body part that executes the masturbatory behavior, and since masturbation at Freud's time was viewed as a dirty habit, hand washing is an unconscious undoing of masturbation. It cleans what is dirty, it relieves anxiety, and some of the libidinal energy seeking release in masturbation may actually find discharge in the substitute behavior. Even the motions of the hands around the soap may contain some similarity to masturbatory behavior. In a more general sense, the unavailable or unattainable gratification of sexual needs may find displaced expression in oral activities such as smoking, kissing, applying lipstick, drinking, whistling, singing, talking, chewing gum, and spitting. The adolescent's first serious infatuation with a somewhat older, motherly teacher may be viewed as a displacement of the unacceptable love impulse toward his mother. However, since even the teacher is unavailable and socially unacceptable as a love object, a further displacement directs the love need to a more readily available girl of a similar age. However, she, too, may possess some characteristics of his mother. Thus, in the search for a mother substitute, one displacement may be put on top of an earlier displacement. Identification is a process by which characteristics and qualities of an external object, frequently another person, are absorbed into one's own personality. Freud prefers the term identification over the term imitation, since identification implies the involvement of deeper, more significant layers of the personality, as well as a more permanent change. Imitation, which is part of identification, is superficial copying of behavior. The person with whom a child identifies changes as the child moves through the developmental stages. The successful resolution of the Oedipal conflict requires an identification with the same-sex parent, a process that greatly enhances superego formation. However, with the beginning of adolescence, parental identification dramatically declines and identification with movie heroes, entertainment personalities, and famous athletes, as well as coaches and teachers, is common, a process that aids in achieving independence and establishing a personal identity. A primitive form of identification finds expression in eating something in order to become more like the object eaten. Thus, the hunter may eat the lion's heart in an attempt to become as brave as the lion. In the Christian sacrament, the body and blood of Christ are eaten in order to become more Christ-like. In isolation or intellectualization, the actual impulses reach the conscious, but they are isolated from the strong affect that usually accompanies such impulses. Feelings and intellect are separated so that a threatening situation loses its emotional impact. The feelings are repressed and the problem is viewed in abstract intellectual terms. The psychoanalyst refers to the process as the cathexis, since the object has lost its cathexis. Cathexis is the concentration of mental energy on a specific idea or object. In other words, affect has become separated from content, as in a person who is insulted but does not feel anger. Isolation of affect means that mental activities that usually occur together are separated, a phenomenon not at all uncommon in adolescent sexual development when, for example, sexual sensual needs are gratified with one person, for example, a prostitute, while the erotic affectional feelings are reserved for the beloved virginal sweetheart. In a religious scientific sense, isolation would find expression in a dual incompatible belief system by the same person who, as a religious person, believes in the biblical story of creation and, as a biological scientist, believes in the Darwinian theory of evolution. Patients in therapy may develop an elaborate and abstract self analysis of their problem, but have no real feelings about it. Instead, they try to convince the therapist of how much insight they already have, even though the problem behavior remains unchanged. Among the many defense mechanisms that the ego can use, Anna Freud considers two especially characteristic of the adolescent coping with the onslaught of sexual tensions: intellectualization and asceticism. Both may be used before pubescence, but they become especially important during this period of sexual disequilibrium. Asceticism is characterized by rigor, self denial, and mortification of the flesh. It is typically seen as a phase in puberty, where it indicates a fear of sexuality and a simultaneous defense against sexuality. Asceticism in an adolescent results from a generalized mistrust of all instinctual wishes. This mistrust may go far beyond sexuality and may include eating, sleeping, and dressing habits. The increase in intellectual interest and the change from concrete to abstract interests or thinking are accounted for in terms of these defense mechanisms against the anxiety produced by the libido. Autorank contrasts promiscuity with asceticism as the two adolescent defense mechanisms that aid in maintaining independence. Having just freed themselves from the emotional dependence on parents, adolescents avoid any kind of strong emotional attachment, including an intimate personal love relationship, since it implies a new kind of mutual dependency. Being promiscuous satisfies sexual urges without the loss of the newly acquired independence, since such sexual gratification takes place without genuine love, personal commitment, and ego involvement. Separating the physical side of sexuality from its emotional component, as the practice of promiscuity implies, is of course a form of intellectualization as defined by Anna Freud. By being ascetic, adolescents retain their independence because they willfully reject any kind of personal, intimate involvement. Periods of asceticism may alternate with periods of instinctual gratification. In both instances, the adolescent avoids the real love relationship in which self-restraint, self-subordination, and dependency are necessary to maintain permanent intimacy. In reaction formation, reversal into the opposite, the unacceptable impulse is repressed from consciousness but readmitted as its very opposite. Thus, the hostility an unmarried teenage mother may feel toward her newborn baby is unacceptable and is replaced by too much kindness, resulting in overprotection. Overcompensation often accompanies reaction formation, so that, as in this illustration, too much kindness is provided. The expression killed with kindness aptly illustrates the tendencies that underlie this kind of defensive kindness. The function of kindness is not really to help other people, but to release the anxiety and guilt associated with the true feelings of hostility. Similarly, hate may be transformed into love. The question arises, how can the new defensive emotion of kindness or love be distinguished from the true kindness or love? Several characteristics suggest that an emotion may be the product of reaction formation. Extreme forms of the defense emotion, some inconsistency since the negative emotions may break through when one is off guard, extravagant showiness, and compulsivity. The extreme and intolerant crusades against various vices are often a reaction formation against unconscious impulses toward that very same vice. The individual inclined toward criminal behavior may, through a reaction formation, become a highly effective police detective. Unacceptable homosexual tendencies may manifest themselves as extreme disgust and crusading against homosexuals. The puritanical censor of pornographic films and books may gain secret satisfaction from viewing the suspect material. Introjection or internalization has certain similarities to identification, such as the internalizing of outside events or characteristics of other people into the protagonist's personality structure for defensive purposes. However, introjection is more limited in scope. The whole personality is not restructured, only a specific part, as when an individual internalizes society's values as a guide to behavior. An extreme form of introjection is the identification with the aggressor, seen even in concentration camps among older, surviving inmates who assume the behavior and the values of the hated Gestapo. Apparently, an attitude of, if you can't defeat your enemies, join them, prevailed. Projection is the opposite of introjection in that one attributes or projects to somebody else impulses unacceptable within oneself. In other words, we ascribe to others those feelings that we ourselves have but find unacceptable. Projection is, in certain respects, similar to rationalization. The adolescent boy, for example, claims that none of his peers like him, when actually he likes neither himself nor others. This mechanism of defense serves a dual purpose. 1. We free ourselves of the unacceptable and frustrating feeling, relieve anxiety. And 2. We get rid of some of our tension and frustration by complaining about the nastiness of the individual to whom we have assigned our own unacceptable impulse, and we can pretend that we are the innocent party. A highly irritated adolescent girl, for example, angrily accuses her parents of being inconsiderate and ill-tempered. If asked what the parents did, she might respond, "They irritate me." Or, to take another example, if we dislike someone, projection allows us to interpret everything that individual does as an expression of that person's dislike for us. Although almost all mechanisms of defense distort reality in one way or another, denial is the most primitive defense because it does not only distort the cognition of reality, but denies the existence of some emotionally significant part of reality. We refuse to acknowledge that the source of our distress actually exists. In contrast to repression, denial focuses on external reality. However, it does seem to serve a function quite similar to repression. This defense is not common in very young children, since they have not learned to distinguish between fantasy and reality. It begins to appear in the anal stage and is very common in neurotics and psychotics. In its extreme form, denial means that an existing sector of reality is blotted out. An example is the rejected bride in one of Dickens' novels who kept the wedding table set and her wedding gown on for years after the groom left her waiting at the altar. Another is the boy who plans and talks of graduate school and of becoming a lawyer, even though he barely receives passing grades in his academic high school subjects. Still another is the girl who has no boyfriends but sits anxiously near the telephone every Friday evening in the hope that someone may want to invite me out tonight. Because the process of denial is unconscious, the person is not lying. The most common form of denial is blocking a past event out of memory. We say, "I don't remember," and we actually do not, but everybody else remembers quite well. Less serious use of denial seems to occur when we attempt to avoid unpleasant events in our real environment. We look away from an unpleasant or disgusting sight. Another form of denial is postponing an unpleasant task, such as writing a term paper or studying for an exam, without much concern for the consequences until the work is due. There is some debate as to whether sublimation ought to be considered a defense mechanism, since it is basically a constructive and adjustive process. On the other hand, sublimation is really a specific kind of displacement. In sublimation, the libidinal instincts, rather than being displaced in neurotic behavior, are rechanneled into constructive and socially acceptable behavior. The libidinal impulse, even though it is transformed, is actually discharged. In the sense that the unacceptable impulse is discharged, sublimation differs from all other defense mechanisms, where the energy is repressed or distorted. The common illustration is the creative artist who sublimates his anal impulse to smear feces all over by painting a beautiful picture on canvas. More to the point, Freud maintained that the gorgeous male and female nudes created by Renaissance painters were really the result of sublimated erotic impulses. Lincoln chopped wood to sublimate his anger. For Freud, the development of civilization was the result of sublimation of instinctual energies. Sublimation takes place if a socially acceptable and closely associated substitute object can be found for a libido force so that the partial satisfaction can take place. This process of seeking and finding a substitute activity is still an unconscious one, except when the football coach demands sexual abstinence from his players 2 weeks before the big game. Psychoanalytic treatment is intended to direct the patient towards sublimation. The final goal of psychoanalytic treatment is to have the patient accept his or her desires and wishes, sublimate them in a socially acceptable way, and find a normal way for sexual satisfaction. Undoing takes the form of atonement, penance, repentance, apology, restitution, and being punished or punishing oneself. When an unacceptable impulse has broken through and manifested itself in actual behavior, through the process of undoing, we attempt to counteract the undesirable acts or desires or thoughts and to reduce our anxieties. Children are taught at an early age that when they engage in socially disapproved behavior, they are punished or they have to make up for it, since it is only through punishment or atonement that the misdeed can be negated and the individual can start over with a clean slate. If this cleansing process does not take place, the anxiety, guilt, and self debasement will threaten the ego. Hence, the individual tends to undo what has been done, just as one erases a misspelled word to start over. Freud provided an illustration of undoing. His patient, while walking down a country road, kicks a stone onto the middle of the road. He then reflects that when his beloved's carriage comes down the road, it will hit the stone, overturn, and kill her. To undo this potential murder, he now kicks the stone off the road. On reflecting further, he decides it's all very silly, so he kicks the stone back to the center of the road. He repeats this sequence endlessly. The outcome of the use of defense mechanisms is a reduction in drive and anxiety. Defense mechanisms satisfy immediate needs and do reduce frustration, but often their benefit is short-lived. The damaging effects are evident in their long-range consequences and their negative impact on other people. Frequent use of defense mechanisms impedes learning, personal growth, and satisfactory interpersonal relationships, since most defense mechanisms tend to increase the social distance between the individual and others. Quite commonly, the attitudes and behaviors expressed through such mechanisms are evaluated by observers as defensive, immature, unrealistic, and neurotic. Educational implications. Freud assumed that frustration of normal sexual satisfaction may lead to the development of neurosis. Even at the risk of overgeneralizing, the psychoanalytic argument may be stated as follows. Therefore, if parents do not want their child to be neurotic, they must not discipline their child in a frustrating manner. This statement implies that educators should avoid frustrating adolescents unnecessarily and question the prudish Victorian attitude towards sexuality prevalent at Freud's time. But since sexuality, for Freud, is defined rather broadly, that is, to include everything that relates to and grows out of a person's love life, one might go one step further and assume that parents and educators should keep frustrations to a minimum, especially those frustrations that block the satisfaction of basic human needs. What is needed instead is an atmosphere of leniency, love, affection, approval, and attention in which the child can grow up feeling secure, wanted, and loved. A similar idea was expressed in Rousseau's natural romanticism and especially in his emphasis on negative education. More recently, psychoanalytic ideas have been influential in the creation of a variety of educational experiments, the best known of which was A.S. Neill's school, Summerhill. Summerhill attempted to remove all restrictions and frustrations from the educational process, including many of the common restrictions on children's sexual curiosity and exploratory sexual behavior. The school was designed to fit the child rather than to make the child fit the school, and the intent was to make Summerhill the happiest school in the world. But even for the regular classroom teacher in a more conventional setting, some of Freud's ideas can be applied for the benefit of the pupil and the educational process. By applying psychoanalytic thought to classroom management, discipline becomes less authoritarian and therefore less frustrating. Even when the kind of freedom provided in Summerhill may be inappropriate, there can be a genuine concern with the underlying causes and dynamics of disturbing, disruptive, antisocial acting out behavior. Even for a teacher with only rudimentary understanding of psychoanalytic principles, misbehavior can no longer be viewed as arbitrary, as simple meanness or a personal affront, but rather it must be seen as a symptom of underlying conflicts and causes. What an individual does or says is not meaningless, but has a cause. Just as errors in conceptual development reflect lack of understanding, use of a false method, or incorrect reasoning, so lack of self control, rudeness, moodiness, and disobedience may serve a psychological purpose. A basic assumption of psychoanalytic theory is that all behavior is meaningful. Dreams, neurotic behavior, even a slip of the tongue, and forgetting and losing things are motivated. If there is no conscious motive, they are assumed to be unconscious. Education has been slow in providing a place for the affective domain in its structure and curriculum. However, much of the recent efforts to legitimize emotions in the educational process have their roots in the writings of Freud and are made explicit by some of his followers, Anna Freud, Lawrence Kuby, and Richard Jones. The child's fifth freedom is the right to know what he feels, but this does not carry with it any right to act out his feelings blindly. This will require a new Morris for our schools, one which will enable young people from early years to understand and feel and put into words all the hidden things which go on inside of them. Psychoanalytic theory assumes that talking about and play acting dreams, fears, and aggressive or hostile feelings not only brings them out into the open, but cleanses them and reduces their magnitude. In addition, openly sharing emotional problems in a classroom of peers leads to the realization that others have similar, if not the same, fears and feelings. The freedom of one individual to express what another individual inhibits often results in freeing the latter. In their concern about normality in regard to physical development, sexual needs, social sensitivities, and their intimate problems, adolescents can benefit from the realization that their thoughts are not really too different from those of their peers. The inhibition of sexual energies that most Western societies demand of their youths is the basis of Freud's concept of sublimation. Damming up libidinal energies must swell the force of the perverse impulses, so that they become more powerful than they would have been had no hindrance to normal sexual satisfaction been present. It follows that early infantile sexual activities should not be repressed or pushed into the unconscious, lest normal sexual development be perverted. If libidinal energies are forced to regress to earlier stages of sexual development and denied any normal satisfaction, substitute satisfactions in the form of fetishism, sadism, masochism, narcissism, or other neurotic symptoms may manifest themselves. Yet, psychoanalytic theory does not advocate uninhibited gratification of sexual impulses. Freud suggested redirecting sexual energy by means of sublimation. Most Western cultures oppose unrestricted sexual gratification in their young and assume that uninhibited sexuality would create new and different problems. Furthermore, since society's values are already represented in the adolescent's personality structure by means of the superego, which develops during the latency period, the social-sexual conflict is a psychological internal one, a conflict of the conscience. Freud does not make a specific statement about adolescent sexual gratification. But since during this time, the sexual drive and internal and external forces controlling the expression of sexuality are strong, sublimation can be a means of guiding these energies into productive activities, thus contributing constructively to the learning process. In practicing sublimation, an individual finds substitute forms of satisfaction and tension release for unsatisfied libidinal energies. It is assumed that non sexual aims and socially useful activities absorb some of the sexual energy. Hence, many educationally desirable activities may be stimulated by denying sexual gratification. For a long time, football players and athletes have been advised prior to major sports events to abstain from sexual activity. Through sublimation, sources of sexuality are discharged and utilized in other spheres, so that a considerable increase of psychic capacity results. The connection between sexual energy and productivity in the fields that appeal more to emotion, such as music, art, poetry, and literature, is another of the assumptions of psychoanalytic theory. Freud developed a theory of culture and civilization in which all human creations, from the learning of language to the composition of symphonies and scientific inventions, are due to sublimation. Sexual impulses have contributed invaluably to the highest cultural, artistic, and social achievements of the human mind. Since sexual urges appear to be strongest in the late adolescent period, if Kinsey's outlets are taken as an indication of the strength of sexual drive, and since internal and external restrictions are also strongest during this period, at least for middle class American youth, sublimation appears to be one important educational objective during this period. If society can use sublimation to provide a harmonious balance between realistic denial of gratification and fulfillment of basic needs without repression and utilization of sexual energies, and thus avoid the two extremes of maladjustment, neurosis, and delinquent behavior, the productivity and creativity of the individual could be vastly increased. Sublimation remains a theoretical model, and Freud stated quite frankly that very little is actually known about the physiological and neurological process of sublimation. Freud believed that applying psychoanalysis to education was most important, but he admitted quite openly that he had no special understanding of it. He did credit his daughter Anna with making this aspect of psychoanalysis her life work and thus expanding his theories. Anna Freud's interest in child psychoanalysis and education is expressed in many of her publications, but was most explicitly developed in her lecture, The Relation Between Psychoanalysis and Pedagogy.